Okay. Yes, we are live. And we have with us in London the Oracle of London. And we have with us from a secret location, the legend, Mr. Brian Berletic of the New Atlas. Brian, how are you doing and where can people find you?
I'm doing very well, and thank you so much for having me on. Again, it's always an honor and a pleasure. If people want to find my work, just go to YouTube, look up the New Atlas, and then in the video description below each video, you'll find all other options to find and follow my work.
Fantastic. And I will have all of Brian's information. I already have it actually in the description box down below. And when we finish the live stream, I will have it as a pinned comment up top. And hello to everybody that is watching us on Rockfin. Hello to everyone on Rockfin. Hello to everyone on Odyssey and everybody watching us on Rumble. And of course, our amazing locals community, the Duran.locals.com. Everybody that is watching us on Telegram as well. Hello to all our Telegram viewers and our moderators. Who is in the house moderating? Alan Watson in the house. Zarael is in the house as well. And I think that is everybody that is moderating. And myself, I am also in the house, of course. But for now, I am going to pass it off to Alexander Mercouris and to Brian Berletic. And we are going to be talking about General Mark Milley and Lloyd Austin and what they had to say with regards to Ukraine. We'll talk about the missile that hit Poland, which Zelensky still claims is Russian because his commander told him so. So, Alexander, Mark Milley, for as long as it takes, it takes. He said that about 8 times during the press conference. So, what is going on, gentlemen?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we have an expression in English, you can protest too much. I do wonder sometimes whether General Milley is protesting too much because, of course, even as he talks about as long as it takes, he is at one and at the same time simultaneously apparently going around the corridors in Washington telling people it's time to talk, it's time to negotiate. Ukraine can't gain more ground. They need to negotiate to cement their gains, which is an interesting expression. So he's saying one thing in public, a completely different thing in private. Well, I'm afraid when it comes to Washington and the type of people, the denizens, if you like, of the Washington jungle, well, perhaps we shouldn't be too surprised that they do that sort of thing. And General Milley is doing precisely that. But in fact, we look at this new military package, and we're very fortunate because we have the person here with us who is beyond any doubt, and I say this indisputably, the best person at analyzing, unpacking, understanding these military packages. And I think I'm going to make a general observation, which is just a general comment, largely based on things that Brian has been saying in the past, but also my own sense of the way this thing has been going since about early summer, which is that each military package, when examined carefully, looks less impressive than its predecessor. That gradually, you get the odd uptick from time to time, but that gradually, they're running out of things that they can send. And of course, all of this is happening at one and the same time as the Russians are launching enormous missile offensives on Ukraine. There was a massive one 2 days ago, 90 missiles, according to the British Defence Ministry, which seems a reasonable guess, but I'm not counting the missiles, but I wonder who is, by the way, but presumably somebody is. But anyway, and we are getting more reports today that there's more missiles being launched today as we speak, more drones, more missiles from the Russians. And the firepower of these things seems enormous. And we're getting a sense also that the Ukrainians themselves are becoming increasingly shrill in their demands that help be provided to them to deal with the steady collapse, the disintegration of their energy system. And I've noticed, by the way, that the Russian Ministry of Defense has now started to reference these missile strikes. When they first began at the beginning of October, they sort of ignored them. They were kind of embarrassed about them, I almost felt, because they'd previously said that they weren't going to attack infrastructure. But of course, they are now attacking infrastructure in a big way. And they're now able to talk about it in a way that, and discuss it in their daily reports in a way that they were not doing a few weeks ago. So, Brian, huge privilege and honor to have you again with us on the Duran. We talk about the war of attrition. I think you were the first person to talk about a war of attrition being waged in Ukraine. I think you've also pointed out the limits there are to the ability the West has to wage this war of attrition in Ukraine. And what was your view of this press conference today? What is your view of this latest arms package?
It just seems more of the same. When you're actually looking at it, the focus is on air defense systems, and the reason why is because you see these barrages of missiles and now drones coming in, and I don't know why this was not a priority months ago, but maybe they actually really believed that Russia was going to run out of missiles back in April when they had headlines saying Russia cannot sustain missile barrages. And now they have almost the exact same headline on articles now saying the same thing, and 90 missiles all at once. I mean, that is a pretty large number. And at this stage of the fighting, this is intense fighting every month. So what are they doing to try to stop this? We've talked in the past about Ukraine's air defense systems. They inherited this all from the Soviet Union. The S-300, even the ones they have may be old, but it was always a capable air defense system. And there really is nothing that the U.S. or its allies have that can replace it. So they sent these NASAMS made by Raytheon, and I believe it's a Norwegian company. They created this system. It is firing air-to-air missiles, but in a surface-to-air format, and it's got a shorter distance than the S-300. I was reading the briefing from the Department of Defense today, and they said the NASAM performed remarkably, 100% effective. But I mean, there's one. I think they have one system there. So one system, 6 missiles out of 100 missiles that were fired into Ukraine. I don't know, and that's if they're telling the truth about the performance. I mean, it seems like something that would be an immense achievement that they would want to back up and show the world that. But even if it is true, they themselves, by their own admission, say that they cannot get more of these NASAM systems to Ukraine. There might be 1 or 2 more going next year, and then it'll be years before more can be delivered because it's a new system, and they just don't have a lot of them. They're dusting off the Hawk air defense, these Hawk air defense missiles. This is a system that the United States has not used in its military for 20 years, over 20 years. And so they were just mothballed in storage. You were just talking, Alexander, about these aid packages, how they become smaller and smaller in terms of quality and quantity, I would say. Now, each aid package is talking about refurbishing old weapons that aren't being used, weren't ever going to be used again. It's no longer sending weapon systems from their stockpiles or even putting out contracts to make new weapon systems, because that's going to be years before they arrive in Ukraine. Now they're talking about refurbishing old, antiquated, obsolete air defense systems. So it's self-evident, and we dig into the details and we show people how how inadequate this is if you want to continue fighting for as long as it takes. But they tried to pass it off as if this is immense and continuous aid. And I think the reason why General Mark Milley kept saying as long as it takes over and over again, it's one of those things that I think if they think they say it often enough, it'll actually make it true, contrary to the reality that they face.
I mean, I'm going to just make a quick observation about the United States and wars of attrition, which is that since the Second World War, the United States has not actually had a good record in winning wars of attrition. If you look at Korea, if you look at Vietnam, if you look at Afghanistan, if you look at the various other conflicts that the United States has been engaged in, wars of attrition do not tend to play to US strengths at the present time. Maybe they did back in the 1860s when, Ulysses Grant was fighting in the wilderness, but that was a long time ago. And I would have thought that for General Milley to talk about, as long as it takes, is to demand that the United States win a conflict in a way that it has never won up till now, at least since the Second World War ended. Even the Second World War, we should say, was not won as a war of attrition, ultimately. It was won in a completely different way by the United States. So if it's a question of, trying to exhaust your opponent, it's not the sort of thing that the Americans are generally terribly good at. At least that's my reading of it. I mean, I'm not, as I said, this is much of a military historian, but what do you think about that?
I think you're right, and I forgot to add. I mean, we were talking about this as a war of attrition when Russian President Vladimir Putin announced the special military operation in late February. He said the first thing he said was demilitarization, and there's a lot of ways to interpret that. But looking at, in hindsight, at the last many months now of fighting, it really looks like by demilitarization, they mean eliminating the entire military and doing it in a very methodical, incremental way, a war of attrition, essentially. And we, myself included, I have assigned objectives to Russia that they never actually said that they had. I still believe that they want to create a land bridge all the way to Transnistria, take Odessa, take back Kharkov. But that was not actually something they announced. They also didn't announce wanting to incorporate Kherson, Zaporozhye. They never said that in that speech in late February. So all of these things considered, we don't have access to the Russian general staff or the Russian president. So we could only guess with the information we have available. But it really does look like a war of attrition. And as a war of attrition, you want to create as much loss among your enemy as possible while avoiding as much loss among your own troops. And that is exactly what Russia is doing. They will trade territory to achieve this. And so they left Kherson City. Ukraine, they were losing brigades trying to take that. And they had been unsuccessful. And the only time they actually had success was when all of the Russian forces were on the other side of the river. So that's very telling. It's also telling that even the Western media, who tries to paper over the realities of this conflict, even they admitted to the lopsided nature of the fighting between Ukrainian and Russian forces, how outmatched Ukrainian forces were. And that is because the West simply doesn't have the type of weapon systems that they need. And the systems that they are sending are not in large enough numbers to make any sort of real difference. It's enough to prolong the conflict. That's true, but it's not enough to even change the nature of the fighting on the battlefield, let alone the outcome, the ultimate outcome, which I do believe is to just exhaust Ukraine. So they're hitting the military, now they're hitting the infrastructure. How long do people think this is going to last for Ukraine versus the type of losses, much fewer losses Russia is taking?
Of course, Milley talks about as long as it takes. It's important always to remember that the price is being paid first and foremost by Ukraine itself. It is paying the price in terms of, well, the Russians said 12,000 men died in Ukraine, in the Ukrainian army in October, over the course of October. So they're losing, 10 plus thousand men a month. And, it's very glib, it seems to me, for people in the West to talk about as long as it takes, when, of course, it's someone else who's paying that kind of a price. Because, of course, every one of those 12,000 men who die, well, there's families, there's relatives. I see every day now pictures of cemeteries in Ukraine full of Ukrainian flags, soldiers who've died in the battle. And how many more of those cemeteries are we going to have before it's, people like General Milley decide that, maybe Ukraine has taken enough? I mean, that's again something that, by the way, never gets spoken about. You never see those pictures of the cemeteries that I see every day in Ukraine. You never see them in the media here.
So to talk about the losses, go ahead.
No, go ahead, please.
Well, I was going to talk about the losses. The Western media doesn't want to talk about Ukrainian losses. They create these numbers regarding Russian losses. They never break them down. They never explain how did you get to 80,000? How did you get up to 100,000? And how are you writing articles when they actually do have to examine the fighting? How are you writing articles about the fighting around Kherson and admit that you're losing at least 5 Ukrainians to every Russian soldier lost? How do you calculate these numbers? And then what does it say about the actual losses Ukraine is suffering? But you're absolutely right about this point about General Milley saying, for as long as it takes. Again, it's not their blood. It's not even their money. It's the Western people's tax money, and it's other people's blood. So they could afford to do this for as long as they want. And we've seen the United States wage proxy wars around the globe. They have no concern at all for the future of these countries. These conflicts are unfolding, and they don't care. They don't care if there's nothing left at all. Look at Libya, for example. Look at the state Syria is in. So they're going to do the same thing to Ukraine. They're going to continue this for as long as possible until it just isn't possible anymore for them, because of something Russia does on the battlefield, something they do to shape the battlefield that makes it impossible for the United States to continue. Kind of like what they've done in Syria to sort of win the conflict, but also freeze what remained of the conflict. That is what Russia did there, and that's something Russia is probably going to have to do in one way or another in Ukraine.
Can we just talk about these hawks? I don't know much about military technology, but I can remember going back in the 1970s in Greece, and there was a big talk at that time about Greece buying Hawk missiles from the United States to supplement our air defense systems. I mean, this is a very old system. And as I remember, it was intended to defend against, Turkish, well, we didn't want to talk about the Turks because they're our allies, but Warsaw Pact aircraft. I never heard of the Hawk being used as an anti-missile system before. I mean, is this a completely new version of the Hawk, or is it just the same Hawk, just a bit trimmed a bit to make it a little bit more advanced? How do you refurbish something like this and make it effective in a modern battlefield?
All really good questions. Unfortunately, we only know as much as the Department of Defense has said about the matter, which isn't much. A lot of Western journalists, they want to tell their audiences that everything is going great, but when they're in these briefings, you can tell they're going to have a nervous breakdown, trying to get the senior defense official to say something that they could at least spin. But no, these are incredibly old systems. They were designed in the 1960s. Again, the United States hasn't done anything with them for over 20 years. I've heard that I think it was the Iranians had a certain number of them, and they were able to use them effectively. But again, as you say, I don't think it was in an anti-missile capacity. And anti-missile systems are very complex, very hard to get right. Look at the modern Patriot system, say in Saudi Arabia. Look at the trouble that is having. How are they going to refurbish these missiles to be even remotely useful for Ukraine? But even if they are somehow useful, somehow they manage to do it, they're just going to be in such few numbers that's not going to make a difference. Like the NASAM, well, it's 100% effective according to the Pentagon, but you could only fire 6 missiles at a time from one system, and that they only sent 1 or 2 systems. So what good is that going to do when you're facing a barrage of 100 missiles, and 100 missiles going in all different directions in Ukraine, not just hitting one target? How are you going to get 2 NASAM systems or 5 Hawk systems? How are you going to cover all of Ukraine with that? This is a huge problem. So we can look at the specifications of the missile systems, but just when we talk about the quantities that are being sent, they're in such small numbers that even if it was a superb system, it's still not enough to defend Ukraine's airspace.
It's put to me that the United States, the West, has never really developed air defense systems to anything like the level that the Russians have. Anyway, simply because we've always fought every single war since 1943, since Kasserine Pass, with massive air superiority. The idea of going into battle relying on air defense systems simply isn't part of our agenda, of our conception in terms of the way in which we wage war in the West. Is that true?
Yeah, that is true. And that's something that even Western analysts at these US government and arms industry funded think tanks, this is something that they admit. The CSIS, they have a whole missile defense program, a program to study the topic of missile defense systems and, actually missiles in general. And this is something that they say the United States never really heavily invested in it. This was a top priority of the Soviet Union and then of the Russian Federation, and they have the best air defense systems on Earth. So it's not just an issue of capabilities. The United States and its allies never invested in the capabilities. It also didn't invest in the quantity. So that is why, they really just don't have anything to send to Ukraine that is really that capable. Again, the systems that they're sending, the Hawk, the Avenger, people might not know what the Avenger is. They're sending 4 Avenger systems to Ukraine, and it's mounted on the back of a Humvee. And they have these high-tech looking missile pods, but when you open the door, it's the man-portable system just kind of plopped into the pod, and then they close the door. And that's what it is. They're already out of Stingers. And so their idea to help Ukraine is to send a system that's going to expend even more of these missiles that they're running out of. So this is a huge problem of both quantity and quality. It's the worst kind of problem to have in a war of attrition.
Yeah, I mean, I should say, about a year and a half ago, I did a program on the Duran, on my channel, in fact, in which I actually looked at the history of Soviet air defense developments. And they really go back to the 1940s, because the Soviets were confronted with this sense of the overwhelming power of the US Air Force. And they said, there's absolutely no way we can compete with that. We are never going to build aircraft in the kind of volumes that the Americans have. We can't develop, we can't train the numbers of pilots. So they looked around and they said, what are we going to do? We're going to build an air defense system. And I did quite a lot of research for this, because industry and industrial things are something that I always found quite interesting. And one of the things I discovered is that the Soviet air defense system, which has evolved into the Russian air defense system, is never about one missile. It's an incredibly integrated, very heavily layered system that brings together lots of different systems, each of which are supposed to complement each other. In fact, they do. They complement each other very well. So you have point defense systems which use cannon and missiles. You have more advanced missiles, and you have still more advanced missiles, and you have this enormously complex but very thoroughly integrated system backed by electronic warfare capabilities, which again the Russians have invested in massively. Now, I don't see anything remotely like that in the West. Ukraine, strangely enough, has the remnant of a part of a system like that, because, of course, they've developed what they have. What they have is a legacy of what was left to them by the Soviet Union during the Cold War. The Soviets developed a fairly sophisticated air defense system in Ukraine, because Ukraine was a major assembly area for Soviet forces moving west. So that's why Ukraine had a sophisticated air defense system left over from the Soviet Union. But there is nothing remotely comparable in the West that can replace it. And we're talking about the S-300. The S-300 isn't a single missile. There's lots of different missiles that constitute a very complex family of the S-300s, all of which are able to sort of operate together. Now, again, we don't have anything like that because we have never really imagined ourselves in a situation where we're waging a war, where we don't have air superiority.
That's exactly right. That's a very good rundown. And I actually heard you talking about the S-300 in your video about the Polish missile incident. So that's exactly right. They have it's an integrated air defense system. Ukraine had a old, antiquated version of what the Russian Federation now has, and yet is still far superior to anything that NATO can hand over to them. Now we hear this talk about where the system is battered. They cannot replace launchers. They cannot build more missiles for it. So we have to give them Western systems. And you have all of these different systems from different countries, from different decades. And they're talking about they're going to turn that into an integrated air defense system, which maybe is possible, but it will be very difficult. In Russia, they're creating these air defense systems with the idea in mind that it's going to be part of the integrated air defense system. It's all the same people working on it, and they can develop it, trial and error, and get everything working properly. How's the U.S. and their allies going to do this for Ukraine in the middle of a war? Remember, they sent 1 or 2 NASAMS systems to Ukraine now. They'll send another 2 or 3 next year, and then onward from there. Who's to say, and how likely is it that they're going to have the systems that were sent this year, next year, that they're not going to be found and destroyed? They're less capable than Ukraine's S-300 systems, and Russia has been finding and destroying them. If you look at the way this conflict has been unfolding, the air defense system obviously limits what Russia can do, but it hasn't changed the outcome. The outcome being Russia destroying Ukraine's military faster than it could be built back up, and Russia not losing the same or greater number of men or equipment. So this is a huge problem, and you're looking at this is the historical roots of this problem, and you're absolutely right.
The NASAMS, the very fact that it uses an air-to-air missile, however well you adapt it, it's already an adaptation of a missile and of a system designed for some other completely different purpose. It's not the same as a bespoke system integrated into another, layered system with, cannons and missiles and radars and all these things all operating together to provide an air cover. And on top of that, we have the Russians are now going to be building. We've just had this information. They've set another order for hypersonic missiles. They're going to be building dozens, apparently, of these new Zircon missiles, which no air defense system in the world is able to intercept, not even the Russian at the moment. And I can't help but think that we're going to be running against, a sort of train that's moving ever further from the station in terms of missile strikes on Ukraine, Russian missile strikes on Ukraine. I mean, isn't it rather cruel to pretend to the Ukrainians that we can help them or we can't?
Absolutely. The whole thing is ghastly what the United States has done to Ukraine, overthrowing their government, putting a client regime, setting them on a course deliberately into proxy war. And then, yes, now in the middle of this fighting, to pretend that the aid is going to be unlimited. And meanwhile, you're looking into the aid packages and you see that it is very limited and it's becoming desperate. And they're not talking about it. People like us in say the alternative media are talking about it, but the Western media is not talking about this, about the Hawk system. They always try to spin these things. I've even seen the Western media try to spin refurbished T-55s as some sort of adequate aid, and it's really going to help Ukraine. When in reality, it's desperate. It's desperation, and it is very cruel to tell the Ukrainians that this is all going to work out and this is going to solve the problem, when in reality, there's really no chance. The Ukrainians, you see them asking for all of these different weapon systems, no matter how unrealistic, because they have nothing to lose. And the United States, they have a lot to lose. They have a lot to lose sending weapon systems that are inappropriate, that will be underwhelming on the battlefield. This will hurt the perception of American military strength and also their arms sales, because who's going to want to buy these systems if they watch them perform so poorly in Ukraine? Whatever the reason is for them performing poorly, is going to, in their mind, it's going to hurt their arms sales. So there's multiple limits at play here, technical, in terms of manufacturing and just quantities that are on hand, and then these political and economic considerations. And for Russia, they have a single military-industrial complex, within Russia operating. They don't have all of these problems. They don't have different countries within this group making all different types of systems that they have to somehow figure out how to make them work together. So it's two completely different systems up against each other. One is much better suited for this war of attrition than the other. And the United States has been fighting these small wars for decades now. Russia seems like it deliberately and specifically prepared for this type of conflict years in advance, I would say.
Absolutely. Well, it's I discussed this previously because, of course, unlike some people, I've actually visited Russian factories. And the thing I would say about Russian factories, and I want to repeat this again, is that they are built with the capacity to surge. It's very different from our style of industrial planning, which is based very much on just in time and all of those sort of things. The Russians always like to operate with enormous reserves of spares, components, raw materials. They build them up in the factories. That means that when the moment comes, if somebody wants to press the button in the Kremlin and say, I need 100 tanks, the system is designed to be able to produce those 100 tanks at great speed. And of course, it makes the system, to Western eye, look inefficient. But of course, it is inefficient, it's an inefficiency which is systemic to the system because it is designed to operate in that kind of way. It's a system that's based on attrition. Going back to Russian historical experiences, extending all the way back to the World Wars. I mean, the Russians had to surge, and they've designed their entire industrial architecture on that principle ever since. And of course, they've also had issues of landscape, issues of geography, issues of communications, which means that factories in Russia can't operate on a just-in-time basis in the way that they can in the West, the big ones. And again, I don't think this has ever been really understood, but as I said, I've seen Russian factories and I've seen how they work and how they can be made to work, and how they can also bring in people in very quickly to start moving production forward at enormous speeds if they have to. And this isn't at all like the way we are in the West. And I was reading again, this is an issue that you've been talking about a lot, Ryan, recently in earlier programs, about 155 millimeter artillery. I read a piece today somewhere which suggested that, if we devoted every single shell that we have in the West, plus those we've ordered, we'd still run out if we continue to supply Ukraine all its needs sometime around 2025. We'd run out of shells entirely. The Russian military system, again, it's basically designed to just go on churning out shells, churning out. It can bring in the components, it can bring in the steel, it can bring in the coke and coal, whatever it needs to do. It can just go on producing shells at rates of millions, whereas we struggle with tens of thousands.
And that's the difference, because the Western military industrial complex is driven by profit. They are corporations, supposedly private corporations, and they're built around the necessity to not only make profits, but to constantly expand those profits. The Russian military industrial complex, China's, actually the many countries in Eurasia, it's purpose driven. They have to make profits. They look for ways that they can make profits. First and foremost, it's about serving national interests and national security specifically. And so this is why Russia is able to get all of these industries focused on the same page and making the weapons. They knew they were going to have to do this. I would probably say years ago. They knew this was going to be an issue, and I think they were preparing for it. Meanwhile, in the West, these are not companies that don't have long-term visions, but it's always about profits. It's not about how can we outproduce Russia, even if it means we're not going to make profits. That thought, I don't think, ever entered into their head, and now we see the results of that. These two systems clashing against each other in this proxy war in Ukraine.
So what happens now? I mean, we've been talking about, the Russians are building up. They're inducting hundreds of thousands of reservists into their military. You've covered that, by the way, brilliantly, if I may say so, on the new Atlas. I've learned an awful lot about how reservists are called up and inducted into battles, because there's been so much written about that. We're getting more reports that more, Russian tanks, artillery, guns, shells, missiles are heading. What are the Russians likely to do? I mean, do you have any idea what their plans are for the future? I mean, as a sort of person with a military eye, looking at the situation, I mean, are they going to go on offensives? Are they going to go big arrow offensives? Are they going to go on grinding down? What is their plan?
I'm trying to go off of what Russian President Vladimir Putin said in late February about demilitarization, and then General Surovikin, he said he's going to grind the Ukrainian military down. And this whole process that we've seen unfold since late February, where they move forward incrementally, they avoid these type of big arrow offensives because you will suffer heavy losses. And you have to ask yourself, why are we willing to suffer these heavy losses? To get headlines, to get territory? If first and foremost we're trying to grind down Ukraine's military, it's best to do it in a methodical way that protects and preserves our fighting capacity while undermining theirs. And again, this is just speculation on my part, but I've heard many people, including myself, I've asked myself the question about why the bridges over the Dnieper are still intact. And I saw your video talking about the ability of Russia to destroy these. And I also saw the report where they were talking about using using warplanes. And I think I agree with you. I think if they really wanted to take these bridges out, they could. The reason they're not is because if their goal is to consume Ukraine's military and to tax it and to undermine it through attrition, forcing them to go all the way from the border with Poland all the way to the Donbas, and then when something breaks down, having to go all the way back to Poland to the workshops in Poland with the Western technicians fixing it and then bringing it all the way back over again. Just think about how that accumulates in terms of fuel, in terms of just the trucks themselves and all the spare parts and maintenance for them, how that makes it so much more difficult for Ukraine to fight. If they blew the bridges over the Dnieper, then they would have to find a way to cross the Dnieper to assault the other side. If your goal is to completely destroy Ukraine's military, you're still going to have to do it, but now you have to cross a river to do it, and now you've helped shorten their supply lines by a significant amount. So that, again, that's just speculation. I don't know, but that's just a thought that's popped into my head. And the way Russia is conducting this military operation, I followed the Russian military intervention in Syria very closely from 2015 onward. And there were a lot of ups and downs. And even though in retrospect, we look at it as a success of the Russian military, I don't remember a lot of days where there was a lot of optimism and excitement. Very, very few. It was often frustration and a feeling of letdown, because that's just the nature of how Russia is. They're very methodical and patient, and they will do things that will drive people crazy.
I think that's entirely correct. By the way, I mean, I agree with that. And I agree with that about Syria too. And I know a lot of people in Syria were very frustrated as well. They were expecting that the Russians would come in and they would, there'd be a huge, mash, bang and smash, and everything would be over within a few weeks. And of course, it hasn't turned out that way at all. And at the same time, the Russians, and this is the thing people never understand, when they wage war with every single tool, and that includes diplomacy as well, which we don't in the West. We tend to see diplomacy as ending when war begins, which the Russians, they don't see that. And they've been very careful to build up their alliances over the last year. And I have to say, this has been the single thing that's been, in some ways, the single most impressive side for me about the way in which the Russians have conducted this. They've handled the sanctions pressure brilliantly, but the way in which they've shored up their alliances has been even more remarkable. And China was important. India was arguably going to be harder, but Turkey was going to be the hardest of all, one would have thought. And yet you can sense that Erdogan is now increasingly tilting, Turkey is increasingly tilting towards the Russian side on this conflict. I mean, is that your view?
That is. And would that have been possible if, I don't remember which year it took place, but Turkey actually did shoot down a Russian warplane in Syria. And I remember a lot of people, the same people who are extremely upset about the Kherson withdrawal, they wanted Moscow to nuke Ankara, and they didn't. Obviously, they didn't. And the reason they didn't do that was because they were thinking long term. They can see how this was all going to unfold. They understood that if they reacted emotionally at that moment, they would be burning bridges that they would need to cross in the future. They're thinking about Syria. They're thinking about Ukraine. They're thinking about Asia. They're thinking about everything. You have to look at all of it and consider that when looking at every decision Russia makes on the battlefield. The conflict in Ukraine is not taking place in a vacuum. It is interconnected with all of these other conflicts and alliances, as you said. So I agree. And I think there's a lot of things that say, like the special military operation, people are saying, why don't you just go straight in and just do it, get it over with all at once? I think that this is an incremental escalation they have to do for domestic and international political reasons, considerations. Imagine what type of position you would be putting, say, India or China in if on the first day, you said these are our Slavic brothers, we want to help them, we're not at war with Ukraine, but just the US proxy regime in Kiev, but then you wiped out the power grid on the first day, or you took out all of the bridges. How would that look? And so this is a political dimension where from a purely military point of view, it didn't really seem to make sense. But if politically, if your allies abandon you and then it allows the US to destroy your economy, then you're not able to fight a longer term conflict that you're pretty sure that you could win. It will just take longer. So I that's, again, I don't know for sure, but I think that is a likelihood.
I mean, I have been, following Indian commentaries about this war. I've been following Turkish ones to a certain extent. I mean, less so Turkish, but much more Indian. And I have to say that at some level, the Indians are surprised at how far they've gone along with the Russians. It's not been difficult for them to do, because the Russians have sort of
gave them stairs instead of a ledge.
Exactly,
yeah.
exactly. And the Indians have been surprised about two things. Firstly, that they've gone as far as they have done on this, because, of course, a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, we were hearing all about the Quad. We were hearing about India realigning with the United States against China. Relations with China had become incredibly tense. Yes, they had good relations with Russia, but partly the reasons they wanted good relations with Russia was because they didn't want Russia to align itself too closely with the Chinese. So these are the kind of calculations that you used to see coming out of Delhi at that time. And then this conflict begins. The Indians don't want to be seen coming down too obviously on America's side, because they value their independence, they value their sovereignty, they value their ability as an independent actor. But the Russians, as I said, step by step, they carry them along. There's the oil deals, there's the other economic deals, there's the currency deals. And the Indians have discovered along the way that this has given them leverage with the Americans, which I don't think they ever quite expected. It's been fascinating to see this sort of game being played. And one has to say that the Americans apparently come along to Delhi. They say, we insist, you can't possibly support the Russians over Ukraine and things of this kind. And I think they come across as very overbearing and rather arrogant. The Russians draw the Indians along. And I think that the Indians have soured on the Americans and warmed to the Russians, and might even be starting to warm towards the Chinese as well. So it's completely unlike what one would have expected. And with Turkey, it seems to me that the same game has been played with equal skill.
I agree. And we have to remember, this is not just a conflict between Ukraine and Russia. We all understand it's a proxy war between the United States and Russia, but it's not over Ukraine. It's just unfolding in Ukraine. This is actually a battle between multipolarism and the US-led unipolar world order. So when Russia is doing things, just as you say, they have to bring everyone along. And they have to think about, so when you're talking about multipolarism, you're talking about absolutely everyone except for the West, these hopelessly subordinated nations to Washington and Wall Street, Brussels and London. Other than them, everyone else, you want to try to get them on board. And you don't want the first step to get on board to be so high they can't make it. You want to give them these gradual steps. So this is just, I felt like this was one of the reasons they insisted on keeping it apparently small, the special military operation, not declaring total war on the first day, and then incrementally escalating. And even for domestically in Russia, if you said there's going to be mobilization on the first day, I think it might have taken people by surprise. Now Russian people are invested in this conflict. It's not really dishonesty. It's just understanding human nature and that they need to understand how serious this is. And sometimes you can't do that by explaining it to them. You have to show it to them. Watching the West overreact and the animosity of the West toward all Russians, not just Moscow, all Russians. I think this is a wake-up call. This is what would make something like the mobilization, this first mobilization and any mobilization to follow, this is what makes it possible. And I think this way because I saw Russia playing the same balancing act in Syria, and then there's military considerations to keep in mind. The first thing Russia did in Syria was start bombing the supply lines to ISIS and Al Qaeda that were coming right out of NATO. Even though they were doing that and completely destroying these supply lines, the fighting is still going on in certain areas. And you look on the map and you're asking yourself, how is that possible? Because even though you destroy supply lines and you significantly reduce the enemy's fighting capacity, there's always a way to get guns and ammunition someplace. There's always a little bit more just to keep the conflict going, not to change the outcome, but to perpetuate it. And this is what the U.S. is doing in Syria. This is what they're going to try to do in Ukraine. Because a lot of people ask me, Brian, you say Ukraine's going to run out of equipment. They are. We can see that they're running out of equipment. But they're always going to have enough to prolong the conflict, just like in Afghanistan or in Vietnam, for that matter. It's up to Russia to figure out how to end that type of fighting, but there's going to be fighting. You're not going to cut the bridges and then automatically the next day they're out of bullets. It just doesn't work that way.
Absolutely. Can I just say, I mean, I talking about relationships between great powers, I am sure you've watched at the G20 this extraordinary exchange between Xi Jinping and Justin Trudeau, which I think is actually a very, very important event. I mean, it's not just a meeting between Xi Jinping and Trudeau, and Xi Jinping being cross with Trudeau, which, to be straightforward about this, I'm delighted that he is, because I can't stand the man, but that's another matter. I've rarely seen Xi Jinping as visibly angry as he was at that meeting. And a point which I want to make is that what Xi Jinping was accusing Trudeau of doing is something that all Western leaders do. They all manipulate conversations, give away what goes on in private. They spread it through the media. They give distorted accounts of things during the media. Putin very recently was complaining that he had a telephone conversation with Emmanuel Macron. And then several weeks later, he discovered that the entire French media was sitting with Macron whilst they were holding that conversation. And the point Xi Jinping was making to Trudeau is, if you behave like that, if you treat me in that kind of way, then there is no possibility of any trust between us. There's no possibility of any kind of serious understanding being reached between us. And the fact that Xi Jinping, of all people, is prepared to talk so straightforwardly about this, not just to Trudeau, I'm sure he's saying this to others as well, is a sign, to my mind, of how bad trust between the great powers has now become, how trust has completely, to all intents and purposes, collapsed. And largely, to a great extent, because of the way in which the Western powers pretend to conduct diplomacy.
Absolutely. And I think it was your take on the G20. You were talking about how Russia or China and the United States during this meeting between Biden and Xi Jinping, they're talking past each other. No. The United States is not there to talk to China. They're there to subordinate China. China, obviously, no country in the world is going to be okay with being subordinated. So they're going to talk past each other. They're going to come with what they wanted to say. The United States is not interested in respecting China as a nation, its sovereignty, its best interests. The United States is not going to learn anything, surely, or agree to anything. And China is not going to accept the U.S. interfering in its internal political affairs, trying to encircle, contain, divide, and destroy them. And so this is the situation we have. And of course, Canada is one of these Western nations subordinated to the United States. And it's all about posturing, and it's all about this necessity they see in their minds to not ever show respect to these other nations. They're not worthy of respect. If we show them respect, it's weakness on our part, because it's all about projecting strength that they don't actually have anymore, which is what has made them so insecure. So I'm just waiting for Alex's impression of Justin Trudeau, whatever he said when he scampered off into the corner. I want to hear that conversation.
Well, so do I. Can I just make one point though before we get to Alex, and because was Alex's, but the other thing about that exchange between Xi Jinping and Trudeau, which is so interesting, was how Trudeau responded. He didn't apologize. The West never apologizes. He didn't say to Xi Jinping, "Look, I'm terribly sorry. It was an awful mess. It was an absolute, mess up. You have my absolute categorical assurance nothing like that will ever happen again." What Trudeau does, and they all do it, all Western leaders now do it, he retreats into cliches. He does exactly what you said. He postures. He says, we're Canadians. We are these open people. We have to behave like this because that's who we are. And Xi Jinping just has absolutely none of that. He says, well, look, you want a dialogue, you have to create the conditions. And he just shakes Trudeau's hand and walks off. And that, it seemed to me, was so much. It told us so much about how diplomacy isn't conducted by the Western powers anymore. You can't accept that the other side, the fact that they have the whole conversation with Trudeau leaked to the media and then distorted. You can't accept that this is somehow offensive to them, that this is a violation of confidence, that it makes it impossible for Xi Jinping and Trudeau to talk to each other with any sense of trust between them. You don't want to accept that. Instead, you've got to always try to posture, to engage in cliches, and to put yourself in a position of moral advantage. You can't conduct negotiations. You can't conduct diplomacy in that fashion. Both Alex and I have had, Alex comes from a diplomatic family. My members of my family have also engaged in diplomacy on part. This kind of way of conducting diplomacy, it isn't diplomacy at all. No wonder India, no wonder Turkey, no wonder Saudi Arabia, God help us, is now starting to change sides, because nobody will accept being talked in that fashion.
Imagine if you conducted your personal relationships with other people like this. You would have no friends. Nobody would want to talk to you. The last time I confided in you, you told everybody, and then you lied to everyone about it. And then why would you ever talk to this person again? And yet the stakes are so much higher when we're talking about leaders, national leaders, not wanting to talk to each other, because every time they talk to one of these Western leaders, again, it's a complete waste of time, because they're not, what the West wants to do to the rest of the world is something that they know is unjust and that no one would consent to. So why are they even having a conversation except to buy time, or to, again, what Canada or what the United States like to do is, and we could talk about Joe Biden talking with the Chinese president, pretending that you're the reasonable one, and when things get rocky down the road, it wasn't us because we tried, it's them. There's something wrong with them. They have the whole Western media to back them up and to create that narrative. I thought it was interesting when I read the readout from the White House and from the Chinese government, how it was the same conversation, and how two completely almost alien perceptions of it, and how China, I think is really important. They said the current state of U.S.-Chinese relations doesn't serve the best interests of either country. And if you look at the four-chip alliance, for example, how the U.S. is destroying its own IT sector with these rules saying you can't do business in China, and they're closing off that whole market, and all that money that they could have used for R&D and to stay ahead, now it's all gone, and they're destroying themselves. It's very similar to what the United States got Europe to do with Russia over this proxy war in Ukraine, how they're self-destructing. And so they're absolutely right. And then one more thing, the White House, if you read their readout, they're talking about Xinjiang, Tibet, Hong Kong, Taiwan, as if any of this is their business. I don't remember the Chinese readout talking about how Americans don't have clean drinking water or how they have the largest prison population on earth. That's their internal political affairs, and China respects that. It's very easy to identify who's the source of these tensions.
Absolutely. I would just like to finish my segment, which with the S-300 episode in Poland. And there's lots of speculations, there's lots of stories that this was a failed false flag attempt. I don't believe that, by the way. I think it was just an accident. I think it was just a missile that missed and landed in Poland. I mean, you may have a different view. But for me, the single most striking point about this is, of course, Ukraine continuing to lie about this. Lying even after everybody knows what has happened. Even the Financial Times is now saying that they're lying about this. Well, if Ukraine can lie about this incident, why does the West persist? Why do the Western media persist in assuming that anything else they say about anything is true when they lie over something like this?
Well, absolutely. I also do believe that they were off course. Air defense missiles, or at least one we know landed in Poland. And I again, even the United States they've gone as far as saying it was a Ukrainian missile, but we're still going to blame Russia, and then Ukraine is still lying about it. And I just think it's a tragic irony that we're told how dangerous Russia is. It's a danger to Europe, to NATO, to everyone, and yet it's Ukrainian missiles landing in Poland, killing Europeans in NATO member countries, and then on top of it all, it's Ukraine not accepting responsibility and continuing to try to deceive the world about it. That seems like a demonstrably greater threat to Europe than what we are told Russia poses. I just think it's very ironic.
Absolutely, Alex. I've now reached. I think I've had a wonderful conversation with Brian. Do you have anything you want to add? I'm sure you've got lots you want to add.
No, we'll get to some questions. We have a lot of good questions and comments, which I'll get to. But going on the Poland missile story, I agree that it was probably a stray missile. That's fine, but from what I understand, Brian, they were tracking this missile from the get-go. When I mean they, NATO, the United States, whatever. I mean, I've read a lot of reports, and I imagine it's 100% true that they know exactly what missiles, when they're being fired, where they're being fired from, that are coming from Ukraine and even Russia. So they knew, the collective West knew that this missile was fired from Ukraine, from a certain area, and they knew it had a certain trajectory all the way to Poland. But yet they allowed the mainstream media to lie about what happened for about 24 hours. I mean, it took about 3-4 hours for the truth to come out, and it didn't even come out from the collective West. I think the collective West was pressured to say the truth after the internet, after all the experts on the internet, Russian and Ukrainian experts, saw the fragments, saw the photos, and they said, this is not a Russian missile. This is a Ukraine S-300. And it took about 3, 4, 5 hours for the truth to come out. And then everyone kind of seemed to have been forced to admit to the fact this was a Ukraine missile. So what do you make of that? The fact that you had a certain faction in the collective West that were surveilling this missile, and they knew exactly what happened, but yet they allowed the narrative of Russia sends missiles to Poland to last for so long, and they allowed Zelensky to come out and make those ridiculous comments. We have to act now. I told you guys that Russia would attack outside of Ukraine. I told you, and we need to invoke Article 5. I mean, they let this go on, and to me, that was the most sinister side to all of this.
Me? Okay, I will say that there's two things. First of all, we see how bad Ukraine's judgment is. So maybe it was a false flag, because they have just such bad judgment, and they are so indifferent to how the things they say are coming out and being received. Evidently, we see that with them still denying this. But I still think that it was a off-course missile, but because they knew it was going to do damage. That's why they allowed the lie to go. They knew it was going to do damage. And in the majority of the minds of the people they're targeting for this message, they know that even when the truth becomes known, they're not going to care. They're still going to hate. They're going to hate Russia even more. Because it's going to still have that bad taste left over from the initial perception that it was a Russian missile strike. And they're never going to blame you. We've all encountered people like this who are fanatically supporting Ukraine. They will never accept that Ukraine somehow was in the wrong. They will still find ways to blame Russia. So it was about creating maximum damage. That's what I think. And they're indifferent to the lack of trust that they will have in the future.
Mm-hmm. Can you also make the argument that it was also about securing another $37 billion in funding, and then securing more air defense weapons, systems, which is what they accomplished? I mean, if you look at it from that angle, by letting this story run for a good 24 hours, they got what they wanted, which is more money to Ukraine. I mean, close to another $40 billion. $40 billion from the U.S. is going to be poured into Ukraine again, and they're going to be sending a whole bunch more of weapons, but most importantly, air defense systems. Because now you have to send more air defense to Ukraine. Absolutely, it's what you must do now, because we almost had a World War III scenario.
Maybe the argument can be made that a lot of that air defense should be diverted along the border with Ukraine, because you never know when this is going to happen again. And because Ukraine is acting so irresponsibly regarding this, it just seems like if I was sharing a border with Ukraine, I would not want to be sending my air defense, more missiles for them to fire and miss their targets and come back and hit my territory and my people. I think, even though I don't think there's going to be major implications, but I do think that there were some lower level Polish politicians who are kind of upset about Ukraine's behavior regarding all of this.
Well, the mayor of Lublin has spoken out. Can I just add one point to the things that Alex was saying, which is, of course, that we had a senior U.S. administration official talking anonymously to Associated Press, actually fanning the story at one point. I mean, he was actually saying, there's Russian missile attack on Poland.
Yes. No, I agree with you, Alexander. And a lot of people miss the fact that on that very Tuesday, we talked about this before we went live, on the very Tuesday that all of this happened, CIA Director Burns was in Kiev meeting with Zelensky. Now, you said, Alexander, that this is most likely the common route that Burns would take. He would be in Ankara. He met with the Russians, and then he would fly to Kiev to talk about what they said with Ukraine. But my thinking is that, yes, this was an accident, or this was a missile that went off course. It missed intercepting the Russian missile. But my mind tells me that once this happened, once they saw what was going to happen, they said, well, maybe there's a way we can capitalize on this. And let's not have the narrative be right away that this was a Ukraine missile that straight off cost. Let's pause the truth for 5, 6, 7, 8 hours, and maybe we can get some stuff that we're trying to push through. Maybe we can expedite that.
Or at least distract people away from the fact we're sending them millions, billions more. That's another good point. I think that's a good point.
Yeah. So, okay. Do you have time for some questions, Brian?
Yes, I
Alexander?
do.
Yeah,
Yes?
absolutely.
Okay. Okay. So give me one sec. Okay. From Gabrielle, should Ukraine surrender everything east of the Dnieper for the same peace? Does it now realize that this may be the best option still left on the table?
Well, Ukraine does not realize that, and they're not going to do it. I mean, they should sit down and negotiate with the Russians, obviously, and try and come to an agreement going forward. They nearly achieved it back in March, but all the indications are at the moment that the Ukrainians are not really interested in negotiations. I mean, General Zaluzhny, the commander of the Ukrainian army, has ruled them out. And one gets the sense that ultimately he matters more now in Kiev than even Zelensky himself does.
I fully agree. You just have to remember they put this client regime into power in 2014 and kept this circle of people there to cultivate a proxy war. They want to continue fighting a proxy war. This is not about the best outcome for Ukraine. That is not anywhere in the calculus at this point. So no, just imagine if they just upheld the Minsk agreements. Imagine how much better things would be for them now.
Oh yeah. How about this from Trevor right on the screen? Perhaps the 37 billion was fast-tracked because the FTX backdoor collapsed. The FTX story is huge. It's a huge scandal, which is not getting enough attention.
People need to be careful dealing with these exchanges because this is mostly what they're used for. So, it's a good idea on paper, but the way it's actually put into practice this is how it's put into practice. So, they're going to be corrupt and they're going to be laundering money every which way anyway. But it seems like this is one of the ways they're doing it. So people should be aware of that and very careful with their own money.
Yeah. From Nevin Acropolis, could the missile incident actually be a Polish false flag so they can eventually enter Ukraine to help out, i.e. take East Galicia and Volhynia?
I don't think so. I have to say, I think that, I don't like this Polish government at all. I think it's a pretty terrible government, but I can't imagine that it would allow missiles to fall on Poland, as in this case, killing 2 Polish citizens. I think that if you know Poland, it's the sort of place where if you try something like this, people would find out. And I think that I would find out. And I think this is already pretty controversial. And I think that no Polish government would want to do a thing like this, stage this kind of false flag upon itself in that kind of way. There's countries where this sort of thing can happen. I don't think Poland is one of them.
I agree.
Okay. From Mayan, is Putin too risk averse? How might Russians remember the campaign? Saving Russian lives or losing opportunities like Odessa?
Well, I think that we have to wait until this thing is ended before we can reach those kind of assessments. It is a very complex struggle. Lots of things are going on in the Kremlin, which we don't know. Within the Russian general staff, which we don't know. All kinds of discussions take place, which we don't understand. Again, we have to wait until this thing has reached its end point before we can finally make conclusive assessments like that. What I will say about Putin is this: he's very, very careful man, and he always consults very widely before he makes any decisions.
And I that's actually was exactly what I was going to say. I was going to compare it with Syria. At the time, people were being driven nuts over how careful Russia was being and how little they were committing at these different junctures. But in hindsight, you see that is exactly what they had to do to navigate that crisis. And that I feel that is exactly what they're doing now. And just as you say, I think in hindsight, we're going to realize how much of what we think was unnecessary was actually entirely necessary, and that it probably wouldn't have succeeded if they did otherwise.
Yeah.
All right, from Jungle Jin, why do the Ukrainians keep trying to take the ZNPP, the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant? Isn't it sufficiently fortified by now by the Russians not to bother? If not, why not? It's a good question.
Well, what to say? I mean, Ukraine has this propensity, it seems to me, for, you put a prize in front of them and they just keep trying to take it. I mean, Brian was talking about Kherson region. I mean, and Kherson city. And, by the way, I should quickly say that Brian was one of those who thought that, eventually the Russians might pull out of Kherson region. He was far ahead of anybody on this. But the Ukrainians just sent more and more troops attacking Kherson region. They were getting hit all the time. They were suffering enormous losses. In that particular case, the Russians decided they would just pull out. But there was never a Ukrainian breakthrough, but they still kept coming. And they do the same in other parts of the war. They're doing the same in northern Donbass, for example. Ever since they had that success in Kharkiv, they've been bashing on the door in northern Donbass. They've been losing men and they've been losing machines, and they just go on losing more men and they go on losing more machines, but they still do it. I find it very difficult to understand the logic of this. I find it very difficult to understand why they insist on defending every millimeter of territory. But I suspect this is psychological concerns rather than tactical military ones, which I don't really understand. I don't know if Brian has any better thoughts about this. Any insights?
I think I agree. I agree with that. It is a lot about headlines and narratives. We can see how desperate they are chasing all of these narratives. With the nuclear power plant, it's one of these liabilities that Russia is stuck with that they probably would rather not have if they want to focus. And I think that it's the same with holding Kherson City. They likely could have held it, but at what cost? If they're trying to get something else done that is going to advance this entire conflict toward an outcome that they want, they don't want these distractions. And by constantly targeting the nuclear power plant and making Russia responsible for that, how much are they tying up of what Russia has to deal with that? So it could be like not just a fixing operation in the military sense, but kind of a geopolitical or a political public safety sort of fixing operation, just making that a problem for Russia to deal with, in addition to everything else.
Brian, I have to ask you a question which bothers me about Kherson, which is on my mind with regards to Kherson. I agree with everything that you're saying, but one thing that I can't understand is that if Russia felt like it was kind of stuck with Kherson, okay, they got it really quickly in the beginning of the SMO. It was the first major territory that they took over very quickly. There was not much fighting, and they just kind of held on to it for 7-8 months. Why then did Putin and why did the Russian government agree to the referendums and to make it part of Russian territory if after seven months or so they started to realize that, you know what, this is perhaps it's not so beneficial for us to be in this position in Kherson? Why then do you go forward with incorporating a territory that you probably have an idea that you're going to need to leave? Why do you incorporate that into the Russian Federation? Why not just stick with a referendum on Donetsk and Lugansk and save Kherson and perhaps Zaporozhye for later? Because I imagine at that time period where they were going through the referendums, is just my speculation. I imagine they must have had some sort of idea that, you know, we may have to leave Kherson because things don't look too stable or too strategic for us in this area. What are your thoughts about that?
This is all speculation on my part, but I compare it to, say, in Syria, they liberated Palmyra from ISIS, and then they lost it, and then they had to take it back again. And I don't think that was part of the plan. I think it was just what are these just bad luck. It was just something that went wrong. If they didn't think they could liberate it and keep it, why would they have done that and put everyone through that? Because it's just one of those things within an overall successful operation. It's one of these just mistakes that you make. It could be that. It could also be think in our minds now collectively, we are almost 100% sure that Russia is going to take back Kherson City because it's part of Russian territory. If they did not do that, it would have been one of those things where we don't know. I mean, it just seems like Russia is losing territory and getting pushed in a box. Maybe they're not even going to bother. That question would be burning in our minds. Are they even going to bother to take it back? But it's not a question in our minds now because it's part of Russian territory. They're obligated to take it back now.
Can I just add something here? I think the thing to always understand about this is there's Kherson City and then there is Kherson region. Kherson region is 60% east of the Dnieper River. Now, I think the Russians do want to control Kherson region east of the Dnieper River. I think that is a strategically important area for them because it's part of the land bridge from Russia to Crimea. So if you have control of the whole of Kherson region, both east and west of the Dnieper, are you going to carry out a referendum just in the east and not in the west? It might be a difficult thing to actually explain and actually do. So I think that probably we overlook the fact that most of Kherson region is, as a matter of fact, at this time, still under Russian control.
Okay. From Mark Hewitt, do you think the point is approaching when a major Western politician goes against the Western Orthodoxy in Ukraine?
Not in Europe. we might see that happen in the United States, but for the moment in Europe, it's no major Western politician is prepared to take that risk.
Politicians across the West answer to unelected corporate financier interests. So if a politician is going to change their mind, it's going to be because these unelected interests did and told them to. Otherwise, if they do change their minds, they're going to be brought back in the fold, or they're going to be thrown out one way or the other.
All right. Brian from Lindy. Brian mentioned that not running out of guns in a war. My question is, wasn't Odessa once a popular place for running guns?
No.
Guns going in and out of Odessa.
Yeah, I mean that's another time, I think.
Another time.
Yeah, I mean, if you talk about the Greek War of Independence in the 1820s, then of course lots of guns were run out of Odessa and went to the Greeks.
Well,
but of course,
what about weapons moving through Odessa via the grain deal? Do you guys buy into any of that?
Yes,
it's a possibility.
It's a possibility, yes. But I mean, realistically, is it going to be in any volumes that are going to make a difference?
Ukraine prep on the Belarus border seems to indicate they don't think Russia will cut the Dnieper crossing when they start their offensive, or they do and are preparing to accept that loss. Any thoughts from Brent? Belarus, we haven't talked about Belarus. They're building a wall. They're mining the border. What do you think's going on in Belarus, Brian Alexander?
Again, I don't know because, the general staff in Moscow don't share their views with me. So I don't know what the Russians are going to do. At the moment, and I think I'm going to say this, there aren't enough Russian troops in Belarus to form, as far as I can see, a major offensive strike against Kiev. If the Belarus army were to participate, perhaps that would change, but Lukashenko has ruled that out. So I have to say, I think that partly the role Belarus is serving at the moment is that it's providing a very useful platform. There's Russian MiG-31 fighter jets there. They're apparently engaging Ukrainian fighter jets with long-range missiles in Ukraine. They've got their Kinzhal missiles. They're doing those sort of things. But what the Russian plans are about Belarus, I mean, I don't know. And I think that the Russians want it that way. They want to keep the Ukrainians guessing. They want to keep everybody guessing about what they're doing.
I agree. I mean, they certainly convinced Ukraine that they're thinking of possibly doing something from there, and just that and alone creates a kind of like a fixing operation outcome where now Ukraine has to commit resources in that direction, whether something comes or not.
From Jacopo de Nicola, has the West reached the point of max cost profit ratio in this conflict, hence the sudden openness to negotiations? If true, shouldn't Russia escalate instead to give the West a bit of its medicine?
I wish that we could say that in the West things are as calculated as that question implies, that people sit down in the White House and the Pentagon and the State Department, Foggy Bottom, and the CIA, and they work all this out and they weigh all the factors as carefully. I'm afraid I just don't think that's how the West works, or at least how the United States works. I think you see all sorts of fractions and groups of people maneuvering and arguing and fighting bureaucratic battles with each other. Partly it's because, it's always a case of trying to gain influence in Washington. So, General Milley is worried, no doubt, about the depletion of his arsenals. Others, Yellen is worried about the oil price and what's going to happen there and what that's going to do to the economy. In London, Rishi Sunak now has a £70 billion hole in his budget that he's got to worry about. I think that's the kind of way in which most of the leaders in the West are working at the present time. There's a faction within the West, within Washington, the neocons, who Brian has talked about very eloquently. They have plans. I mean, they do engage in long-term plans, and they're very skilled bureaucratic infighters, but they're not the kind of people, I think, who would be interested in these kind of calculations.
From Eliana McKay, isn't this war bad publicity for the Western military-industrial complex? What do they want to cut their losses, Brian?
I think it is really bad for them. Anyone that's really paying attention, but you see how the Western media has created all of this hype behind these weapon systems, and then when they start disappearing, Bayraktar TB2 drones start disappearing out of the skies, they just stop talking about it, so that people don't they forget about that because there's a new wonder weapon everyone's talking about. The HIMARS, I mean, they're still trying to attribute every success, success where Russia is leaving a city, it's vacant, and then Ukraine moves in it. It's not as if they outfought the Russians and forced them out, and they're attributing this to the HIMARS striking a bridge that Russia used to withdraw to the opposite bank of the river. So it is very bad in terms of convincing other nations that you have military prowess, but in terms of the general public, I don't know. And I don't know how that factors in with countries that would be buying these weapons in the future. I don't think, like, say, Eastern Europe, I don't think they have a choice. They have to buy HIMARS.
Right. You guys have time for 2-3 more questions and we'll wrap it up? Yeah?
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
From Jungle Jin, how did the Russians allow their exports to be blocked in EU ports? Why did they even stop there rather than simply sail straight through?
Oh, these are impossible questions to answer. I mean, I think that the story, if you're talking about the fertilizer and the food, from a Russian point of view, this was a massive plus, actually, diplomatically. I mean, it was one of the things that turned Africa very much onto the Russian side, because the Russians were able to say, well, look, we got all this food and we got all this fertilizer in Europe and they're not letting us export it, and you're going hungry, and all that talking about Ukraine is pure and utter hypocrisy. And by the way, I've heard African leaders go on British radio and television, and they've been absolutely forthright in their anger about this. It's about the only occasion when British viewers and British listeners have been given an alternative view of the Ukrainian crisis. It tends to come from Africans. But I don't think the Russians planned that. I think, that Russia is a huge place. The people who carry out the exports, the food exports, export food through European ports because that's the way it's always been done. The same with the fertilizer. They export them through Rotterdam. They weren't told in advance by Putin, that we're going to have a conflict in, Ukraine. And of course they weren't. And on top of everything else, even if Putin had told them, perhaps they wouldn't have anticipated that the West would impose this kind of all-embracing sanctions war that it did. The thing is, because of all this criticism from Africa, there's now finally steps to unblock all those exports. So I think, on balance, from a purely political point of view, the Russians have done very well out of that affair.
Interesting take. There was a question earlier in the stream, Alexander, Brian, about news with regards to Africa since the meeting between Putin and the African Union president. Do you guys know of any significant news that has taken place between Africa and Russia or Africa and China since the African Union started engaging with since that meeting, actually, with Putin and the president of the African Union?
No, I haven't.
Outside of the grain. No, outside of the grain.
I mean, I haven't. But what I will simply say is that the African states. There was another attempt to try and get a UN General Assembly resolution. This time, forcing the Russians to pay reparations, and African countries overwhelmingly refused to support it. So, I think I think by now, the mood in Africa has basically crystallized. It's hardened, as it has in the Middle East, by the way, and it's supportive of Russia in this affair. A fact which upsets the British greatly, by the way, because they've always assumed that Africa is a place that the British and the French together, they still have the dominant influence there. And I think the British in particular have been very upset about this. And of course, we've seen in French West Africa that country after country has booted the French out and called the Russians in, Burkina Faso being the last one.
Right. A question from DF: will Russia secure the pipeline and transit routes first in Ukraine, is what DF means. Wouldn't that be a priority, Brian, to secure transit and pipelines in Ukraine?
I don't think it would be I don't think it would be practical to do that at this point. Eventually, if things go their way, let's imagine that there's some kind of collapse. I think that would be something that they would be interested in doing, and of course repairing all the infrastructure eventually, but not at this point. I don't think so.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Okay. All right, let's wrap it up, and we'll get to all the questions in a dedicated video as well, whatever questions we missed. And let's wrap up this live stream. Euro Gabor says, it seems to me that rather the Ukrainian side using chips from dishwashers and washing machines in their missiles rather than the Russians do. Just saying. Well said. Well said. That was from Rumble. All right, let's wrap up this live stream. Any final thoughts, Brian, Alexander?
I think that I want to just say this. This is a war of attrition. I didn't expect it to be when it started. I was one of those people who thought that the Russians would aim to wrap it up quickly, and of course they nearly did. They had that agreement in March, which they seemed to think was going to respond to many of their concerns. But since then, we are in a war of attrition, and the person to really explain how that works, as I said, is Brian. You need to go to the new Atlas. I always do. And he goes through every single arms package, takes it apart, and you understand what it really all means, which is a lot less than it seems. So we are in a war of attrition. The United States does not have a good record with wars of attrition. It's going to be very difficult to keep the political class in the United States focused on this one, however obsessive they are about the Russians. It's sooner or later we will get to that point, the inflection point, when it's no longer sustainable anymore. I'm not going to try and guess when that's going to be, but Brian gives us this study all the time, and he explains it. And perhaps it's better to understand it in that way than to become overly absorbed with what happens in one particular battle here and one particular battle there, or so it seems to me.
And I would just say that you're watching this human tragedy every single day, and it can become frustrating, and you can become emotionally upset over this. People watching this, just remember, use history as a guide. Use Russia's military operations in Syria as a guide. That is an operation that is still going on right now. And so when you look at how patient and methodical they were, how, as Alexander said, diplomacy is at the center of what they're doing, and all of these considerations that go far beyond the theater of operation their military is in, I think we could get a more realistic grasp on what's going on in Ukraine, and we can temper our expectations a little more realistically as well. And I also just want to say thank you so much for having me on. I watch both of your channels on a daily basis ever since this started, just to remain sane, just to hear other people talking about this and looking at it. It's really nice to know that there's other people out there that are looking at it and dedicated to trying to help other people understand it. So I just want to say thank you again.
And thank you very much for those very kind words, Brian. And again, people should certainly look at your channel to understand what's going on. And just to quickly add, obviously, it's a point that Brian makes, we make, all of this conflict in Ukraine is part of a much bigger global picture anyway. A steady, rapid, actually, very rapid realignment of forces, which is going to change the world we live in. I mean, in a couple of years' time, things will not be as they have been. And I think that this is a rearguard action, in a way, being fought by the Western powers trying to maintain their positions, and they're losing. They're failing.
That's a good segue into this final
Well
question.
said.
You could see it right on the screen. Real quick, from Brian, from Alexander, how similar is current USA to the late Soviet Union?
There are some resemblances. I mean, I studied the Soviet Union. I mean, that was my university topic, and there are rigidities of thinking and ideological rigidities and systems of imposing conformity of thought, which are really, when you follow them, they're really rather unnerving, actually. So yes, I think there are more similarities than I would be comfortable with if I was an American.
Brian, I agree. Yeah, I agree. And I think when people try to imagine what the United States will look like as it declines, I think look at what has happened with other large systems that start collapsing. It can happen quickly, but not overnight, like I think a lot of people imagine. There's going to be a decline, and then certain parts of it will collapse. Certain areas within the region will be stable. Others will be crime-ridden and chaotic. And so look at history to try to help guide you through what is happening now and what might be coming.
All right. Fantastic live stream. Always great to have Brian on. Everybody, the new Atlas, that is the channel to follow. The links are in the description box down below, and I will also have them as a pinned comment as well. Thank you very, very much to Brian Berletic of the new Atlas. Thank you very much to Alexander Mercouris in London. Thank you to all our moderators. Valies is moderating. Reckless Abandon moderating. Alice in Blunderland also moderating. And Alan Watson and Zarael were also moderating as well. Thank you very, very much for all your help. Thank you to everyone that watched us on Rockfin, Odyssey, Rumble, Telegram, YouTube, and the Duran.locals.com. Thank you, everybody. Have a great Thursday wherever you are in the world. Take care.